This is Brandon Helwig of UCFsports.com, and I'm joined by Mitch Harper, who covers BYU for KSL Sports, to talk about this week's matchup in the Bounce House. Welcome, Mitch.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Brandon.
Yeah, well, we were just talking a moment ago, and I remember talking to you, I guess, prior to that Boca Raton Bowl in 2020, but you reminded me, and I knew I had talked to some BYU people, but we actually spoke in 2011, which was back, I believe that was BYU's first year as an independent. And that's when UCF made a trip. I remember it was on a Friday night. And so we actually talked back then as well.
That's right. And that was a game, if you remember, Blake Bortles got into the game late for UCF. And that was a fun matchup. And again, I think there's always been a willingness between BYU and UCF to play anyone and anytime, anywhere. And that's why the Big 12 stage is great for these two programs. But yeah, it's fun to see. That was the beginning of this series, and now to see it on a power conference stage, it's awesome to see the evolution here for both us and these two programs that we cover.
Yeah, I know. Obviously, UCF was just through the roof to be able to join the Big 12. I mean, as just like BYU, just always aspired to kind of make that next move up the college football ladder. And so for BYU, just can you kind of sum up, as someone who's been around for a long time, you've always felt BYU they were Power 5 caliber. They won a national championship 40 years ago. They really should have been in the Pac-12. And we all kind of know why that wasn't, but they should have been in the Pac-12 years ago. But just to get that invite after years of independence, which I know BYU felt like that was the best move for the program, but that had to be kind of lonely at times because you're not competing for conference championships, kind of that week-to-week thing of conference players of the week. You don't have stuff like that, and having kind of establishing those inter-conference rivalries you just didn't have for 13, 14 years or however long it was. So what did it mean for BYU to finally have that power conference invite come with the Big 12?
It was a significant moment for BYU. It was one that took 50 years to really build and get to that moment. I mean, when you go back to Lavelle Edwards, and he took over in the early 70s and kind of quietly built it up, and then they had a controversial, national championship, and I think UCF fans can relate to that as well. BYU had theirs in 1984 in the Pole era, but BYU has always been kind of knocking on the door. They got a passionate fan base, so getting that invite from the Big 12 and Bob Bowlesby, at the time, the former commissioner, that was a big moment. And, when Texas and Oklahoma left and Bob Bowlesby kind of gathered his bearings, he even told me when I interviewed him back in the fall of 2021, he said that, BYU was the first call he made, and it was no issues about Sunday play anymore. It was suddenly like, let's get him in. And I think they would have probably been in, and back in 2016, when there was that, show and basically song and dance at
the dog and pony show.
Yeah, dog and pony show. That's a great way to put it. But then that got derailed, and it's been a road less traveled for BYU going independent, and it did get lonely for 12 years as an independent, but it's all worked out now. And to think that in year 2 in the Big 12, they're 7-0, and you're talking about college football playoff, being a 4 seed if you win this thing. This conference, I mean, that's just stuff that BYU has been dreaming of, just to have access to the highest stages of the sport. And at least for right now, with this current 12-team playoff, there's that access, and that's all BYU's been wanting.
Yeah, I know it's only been, a year and a half so far in football, just a year in men's and women's basketball. But what's kind of been the top moment for BYU? Obviously they had a great basketball season last year, just being in the Big 12. Just maybe looking back at last basketball season, early this season for football, what's kind of been the pinnacle moment, I guess, early on for BYU in the Big 12?
The two moments, are this year of football, Kansas State. That was a breakthrough when Kansas State was number 13 in the country, and BYU wins 38-9, and that was a real a rival moment where, hey, you beat them, you can beat anyone in this Big 12. And from basketball, to win at Allen Fieldhouse at Kansas, and I know Kansas faded last season, really kind of started with that loss to BYU, but to win in Allen Fieldhouse, I mean, so many teams go into that building, and it doesn't matter who Kansas has, and for BYU to win, that was special stuff. And really, it kind of gave Mark Pope the juice to go get the Kentucky job later. But yeah, those were probably the two best moments so far. But I think it's also highlighted how BYU, it's not as easy just to win conference titles. And in the West Coast Conference, they piled up a lot of conference titles, not in men's basketball, but in all the other Olympic sports. This league, it's not as easy, so the competition has been, challenging every single game, every single week, and it's what they wanted. And it's been fun to see BYU buy in a lot more than ever before, because they used to be a program that would do more with less. And I still believe that to be the case with football. There's still a lot of work to be done as far as resources go. But, to see them competing week after week against competition that they could only dream of competing week after week with, it's been fun to follow and cover.
Yeah, that kind of parallels, I guess, with UCF's top moment. They were able to beat Kansas in their Big 12 hope opener this past season. Fans stormed and that was an all-time moment for UCF basketball. And then last season, I guess, for football, they beat Oklahoma State in the space game. All the hype about Ollie Gordon at that time, and they really, even though Oklahoma State still made the conference championship, they really shocked them last year. But just talk a little bit more about, I guess once you get past UCF, the focus is on the Holy War, right? Because you guys got a bye week, right? And then you have Utah. So to finally be in the conference again with Utah after they were the ones who got the Pac-12 invite coming out of the Mountain West years ago. And I guess that might have had something to do with BYU going independent, right? Not long after that. So to finally be in the same conference, and just what does that mean? Because it seems, I don't know. Does it seem like Utah, whether it's, I don't know if it's administration and feels the same way, or coaching staff. I know the fan bases don't seem very appreciative or excited to be in the Big 12, but for BYU having their hated rival being in the Big 12, what's that been like?
Well, for a brief moment, Brandon, I think BYU fans wanted Utah to experience what Washington State and Oregon State were going through. That's what they wanted, right, if you want to really ask BYU fans. But now that it's here, and them being in the same league together, it just adds enhanced stakes. And, BYU and Utah were going to play in football, at least on the BYU side. They were always going to play that. So if you're going to play the game, might as well have it be a conference matchup. And I think so. It's a good thing that the game is here. And, the Big 12 took a kind of reimagined look at the rivalries this year, and I think it might work out potentially. If BYU does escape Orlando, and, we'll dive into this, I'm sure, and that's going to be tough for BYU. But if they can somehow escape with a win this week, they go into the Utah rivalry game undefeated. And man, that's just big time stage, national eyeballs for the Big 12. So the kind of unpopular approach that the Big 12 took by removing it from the final week of the regular season to a random November 9th, it really might pay off and give the conference a really big rivalry showcase game that maybe can pull down some big ratings. I know that I hate getting into that whole game about eyeballs this, eyeballs that. It's like, let's watch the actual football games and size them up that way. But you can't deny the big TV ratings that are happening for some of the other leagues. I'm sure the Big 12 wants to get in on that, and maybe BYU and Utah could deliver that. But BYU probably needs to be that undefeated team to get that big stage.
How hot? I mean, how, as far as, fan bases, that game's on the road at Utah. You guys have been playing every year anyway, but how hot of a ticket is that? Is that with BYU? I mean, obviously with huge fan bases on both sides, like what's the makeup of those games usually? I mean, do the Utah fans sell their tickets to BYU fans, or?
It's always a sellout, and it's always a game that lives up to the price of admission. I mean, the games always come down to the wire. The last time these two teams faced off was in 2021, and that was one of the rare times that was more than one possession outcome. BYU won by 9, but typically it always just comes down to the wire. And yeah, BYU, fans, they try to make sure to protect their seats at in Provo, and vice versa for Utah in Salt Lake, but it's always heated. And, they're for a stretch there when, it was the old head coach, Bronco Mendenhall, when, UCF first played BYU back in the day that we were talking about. Bronco was the coach then. And they felt like there was a little more side antics where you'd have a Utah fan going up to Bronco and wanting to fight him. Yes, that was a thing in 2012. And then there was a BYU fan that was popping off at Kyle Whittingham's wife. I mean, there's always been these sideshow antics with BYU Utah. The coaches between Kalani Satake at BYU and Kyle Whittingham at Utah, there's a great friendship there between those two. Kalani coached for Witt and a lot of respect between the coaching staffs now between BYU and Utah, but fans are as heated as ever. And BYU fans are sensing blood because Utah's down and out and they want to pounce. They want to get a winning streak going. And so it's going to be a high intense rivalry, but I mean, it's the ticket secondary market. It's, a couple $100, and I'm sure it's only going to go up potentially as it gets closer, especially if BYU's undefeated. So it's a heated game. And I really do believe that it's got the ability to be, the marquee rivalry in the Big 12, where Big 12 fans look around and say, man, that would be kind of a bucket list game. If my team's on a bye week, I'd love to go see BYU Utah square off in that rivalry matchup, because it is heated. And the thing is when you add in a religion component, it's like state versus private. It's just, man, it is something so unique in college football. I know there's great rivalries and, Auburn, Bama, Michigan, Ohio State, but this thing is 365 social media. I mean, there's so many strange stories that have happened over the years with the fans. The fans alone just make this thing, crank up the intensity to the highest levels. So it's a lot of fun. The characters, the personalities, it's fun. And I can't wait to see it now in a power conference platform, because for the longest time it was in the WAC or the Mountain West. Now it takes on a Power 4 stage. I think that's pretty awesome too.
Yeah, obviously, let's talk about this year's team. BYU, one of the surprise teams in college football, 7-0, 4-0 in the Big 12, ranked number 11 in the AP poll. Preseason, I believe, number 13 in the Big 12. Utah, on the other hand, was preseason 1, and they're struggling a little bit, I would say. Some really big wins, non-conference beat SMU, who, I don't know if people thought it was as big of a win at the time, but we see what SMU has been able to do. You talked about the win against Kansas State. Most recently, the come from behind win to beat Oklahoma State. So suffice it to say, BYU is surpassing expectations. But for you and for the people who follow BYU day to day, I'm sure you were hoping to see or you were anticipating improvement from last year's 5-7 record. What were your thoughts coming into? I'm sure you didn't predict 7-0, but were you expecting a better BYU team than the one that everyone else thought would finish 13th out of 16 teams?
Definitely was not predicting 7-0, that's for sure. But yes, I was expecting improvement, because BYU took the approach of maintaining its roster with roster retention. They focused on, paying out NIL to maintain its current personnel. And the fact that despite a losing season last year, no bowl bid, the fact that everyone wanted to run it back, I thought spoke volumes about this team, and they're the cliche of culture, but there really is something there with Kalani Sitake. Players love him. I mean, they will do anything for Kalani Sitake. They want to be around that guy. And, so I think that fact and some of the additions that they did make in the portal were impactful. And, I thought they would be a 6-7 win football team. They've already hit 7 already through 7 weeks. So far exceeded expectations. Coming into the year, there was big questions at quarterback. And I know that the players and coaches, they've all said we knew this would happen all along, and that's fine. I understand that, but it was a quarterback battle between Jake Retzloff and Gary Bohannon until the end of fall camp, until game week, and that game week number 1. And Retzloff had his struggles, a lot of struggles last year, starting in the final 4 games of last season. And he was 0-4 in those games. He had a lot of turnovers and a lot of miscues, and it just felt disjointed. And they bring in Gary Bohannon, who Earl, Arkansas native, started his career at Baylor. Then he bounced over to USF, had a reconstructed shoulder. And you thought, is he really going to push Jake Retzloff? I mean, is Jake just going to win it by default? But to Gary's credit, he looked much improved in fall camp. And, it was a legit battle. It was competitive. And Jake emerged on top. And you're still seeing moments from Jake where he'll have 5 throws at a game that will put you on the edge of your seat. But then he'll also have, 5 throws in a game that are just brilliant and next level, throws, NFL throws. So he's sometimes a mixed bag, but I think he's getting better as the weeks go by, and he's really settling in, and he's embracing being the QB1 at BYU, a place that prides itself on its quarterback history, and he's done a really good job. And if you're not 7-0 in college football today without good quarterback play, and Jake's delivered on that, and BYU's defense has been much improved too. So there's just been a lot of improvement. And I think now the challenge is going into this matchup against UCF is, can they take it to another level? because where they're currently at is a very good Big 12 team, but can they get better? I mean, this week, Jake Retzloff said he feels UCF's the best 3-4 football team in America. And I know that's kind of a weird compliment.
Kind of like a pat on the head.
Yeah, it's kind of strange, but the talent, you would know better than anyone. But I mean, UCF's got real legit talent and tons of speed and great personnel that, I mean, I watched that game last year when they played Oklahoma, UCF, and they looked every bit the part of Oklahoma, in Norman. And you thought, this is the team coming from the group of 5. Like, no, like they look ready for the part. So this is going to be a tough test for BYU. And now to be the hunted team where there's a little bit more spice to BYU traveling to town. Before BYU could go into these venues and there's really no energy about BYU showing up. Now when you got a ranking next to your name that's knocking on the door of the top 10, it adds more sizzle to the matchup. So it's going to be fun to see how they kind of continue to evolve this season.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about this quarterback, Jake Retzloff. Obviously, he's kind of made a name for himself because he's Jewish and he attends BYU. I know they've had the hashtag or the joke. They're calling it BYU. So I know he initially came up from the California junior colleges, right? So what was kind of his recruitment like? I mean, was he a guy when he committed, people were thinking this is going to be our future starting QB, or did he surprise everyone when he finally got in there to start after the injury late last season?
So he was a byproduct of COVID. So he was at Centennial High School in California. He was the backup to Tanner McKee, who's currently in the NFL, former Stanford quarterback. So he was behind him, and then he took over, but COVID happened out in California, and he kind of slipped through the cracks. He goes to a JC, then he commits to UTEP. UTEP says he can't enroll because he didn't complete some transcripts or something with his JUCO situation. That's very common. I mean, you and I know, following recruiting, the JC transcripts are always a stickler. So then Jake goes to another JUCO, Riverside City College, and he rewrote the record books there, him and his brother, Reggie Retzloff, a wide receiver, and they had big-time numbers, and Jake emerged by some recruiting outlets as the number 1 JC quarterback in America. And look, that's a far different title than what it meant maybe 10, 15 years ago when JC football was really a really deep. I mean, there was some depth back then with JC football. It's far more shallow these days, but still big time numbers from Jake, and you got to be pretty dang good to be number 1 in your class in anything. And when BYU added him, I don't think fans looked at him as the next, star quarterback, but Aaron Roderick, the offensive coordinator, sure did. And, Roderick looked at him to be maybe the guy that could be QB1 in the heart of, BYU's time in the Big 12. I mean, there were quiet whispers last year when Jake arrived in January of 2023 that maybe he could push Keaton Slovis for playing time, because Keaton Slovis, like many, quarterbacks that come to a school, third school in 3 years, they're there for a reason. They're not an NFL QB. They've got some issues. And there was a thought that Retzloff could push Slovis. Retzloff was behind the 8 ball a little bit. He had a surgery on his tonsils of all things. And then, so it just added up to where that spring ball in 2023, he really got no first team reps, and Keaton Slovis took off as the first team guy. But there was this belief that Retzloff would be maybe the guy in 2024, and then he had to take over earlier than expected because Slovis got hurt. And Roderick really believed in him and likes him. I mean, and it speaks to how they view him, that coaching staff, where they kept him as the starter despite going 0-4 a season ago. So they really like him, and he's not always labeled the most dynamic dual threat guy, but he can run. I mean, he's been BYU's leading rusher. Last week had 9 carries for 81 yards, including that 27-yarder late to set up the 35-yard touchdown pass to Darius Lasser to win the game against Oklahoma State. So Retzloff has done a really nice job, and he's been clutch in 2-minute situation for BYU this season.
Yeah, what does Retzloff do well? I mean, you mentioned he's BYU's leading rusher. Obviously, that's a stat that jumps off the page. You said there's some plays, there's maybe 4 or 5 plays in the game. Sometimes we're on your edge of your seat a little bit. Maybe some risky plays. But what has he done well, and where have you kind of see some areas that could get him into trouble potentially?
Well, I think where he's done really well is just his knowledge of the playbook. He's got a lot of confidence in operating and executing these plays. Last year, it was a journey just to get a play call in. I mean, there was so many issues with delay of games and false starts. The communication was an issue. He's in complete control of this offense. And it's one of the reasons BYU comes into this week as the highest scoring offense in the league within Big 12 games. So he's done a really good job on that front. His arm strength is much improved too. He's had you go back to week 1, he had a 60-yard touchdown pass where it was pretty much all through the air. And same goes for a touchdown pass he had against Kansas State. So Jake has had some big time throws, Baylor as well. But his arm strength's improved, and he's improved in his ball security when running the football. Last year, and even in week 1 and 2 this season, ball security when running the football was a problem for Jake. That's really tightened up since that SMU win where he's not putting on the turf. And, BYU ideally doesn't want to run him because he's so important to the success of this team. But obviously it's in their arsenal where defense has got to account for him as a number. It's the areas where he has some issues is just some of the decisions where he is very aggressive, and he will throw a ball where last week against Oklahoma State, both receivers in the area are completely blanketed. He tries to tightrope it in there.
Yeah.
It gets picked off. You can't do that. Some of those decisions where that aggressive mindset, that belief where he's going to prove people are wrong, sometimes just got to rein that in, just throw it away and move on to the next play. He has done better, though. I mean, there were times against SMU where, he should have taken a sack, and as he's going down, he's throwing it up in the air and it gets picked off. Like, just eat it, move on to the next play. So those are areas where, he sometimes forces the issue a little much, and sometimes it bites him.
So looking at the rest of the offense, who are some of the guys around Jake that, fans are going to be hearing their names on Saturday? Who are some of the other players to watch on offense?
Sophomore LJ Martin, once committed to Texas Tech, then he flipped to Stanford, then he flipped to BYU, class of 2023 signee out of El Paso, Texas. And, he's a really good running back. And what's interesting about him is that he dealt with a shoulder injury in fall camp. And then he dealt with an ankle injury that he suffered against SMU in week 2. Though that kept him sidelined. But, he comes in the last week fully healthy, best he's felt probably since spring ball earlier this year. And, he goes off for 20 carries, 120 rushing yards, a career high for LJ Martin. It was a breakthrough performance. And I just think that it looked like a guy that looked fresh despite the injuries. He looked like he was ready for the back half of the season, where so many guys in this sport, especially at the Power 4 level, they're banged up. The hits, the bruises, they're stacking up as the weeks go by, where LJ looked pretty fresh. And I expect BYU to turn to him early and often against UCF. So keep an eye on number 27, LJ Martin. The receivers have been really good for BYU. Darius Lasser, number 5, had the game-winning touchdown against Oklahoma State a week ago. He's a big play receiver. But I think the best receiver of the bunch is number 2, Chase Roberts. He's a 4th-year junior, former Under Armour All-American out of American Fork High School nearby here in Utah. But he's a talented football player. He's added a little bit of weight to his frame. He's had some big games early on in the season. It's been more so Darius Lassiter in recent weeks, but they form a really good 1-2 punch. And then at left tackle, number 76, Caleb Etienne, former Oklahoma State transfer, had an emotional win last week, taking down his old team because he got benched at Oklahoma State. So that win meant a lot to him. But, he struggled mightily last season for BYU, and he got benched last year. But he's run it back. He never wavered. BYU got a new offensive line coach, and Etienne has thrived. And, his measurables, he's going to have a chance maybe to be an NFL guy just because of his body. I mean, 6'8", 325. He has been really good for BYU on the blind side for Retzloff. So those are the guys I would be keeping an eye on if you're UCF.
Does BYU, do they have many older players? You always hear through the years, the guys, they go on missions and they come back and you're facing like 25-year-old linemen and stuff like that. I don't know if that's true year to year. Do they have guys like that this year?
They have a few, but, BYU's average age is about 21.7. And so it's BYU, Kalani Sitake has done, a really good job of kind of breaking down, maybe stereotypes, if you will, about the older players at BYU. And there's a lot of programs in college football these days with the COVID seniors where they got
the red shirts and the coat and the medical red shirts. And, Cam Rising is going to play, kind of 9 years of eligibility.
Right. Yeah. But BYU, they've had, pretty much guys from all different walks of life, come to BYU in recent years under Kalani. And, when it was Bronco, when UCF came to Provo back in 2011, it was about, 70% of the players served missions for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And keep in mind, those are, it's an optional thing. If you're LDS, if you want to be at BYU, whether you're LDS or not, doesn't matter. You can go to BYU. You don't have to serve a mission, even if you are LDS. So that's totally optional. But yeah, they don't have as many. I think there is one player that I believe is 26. I believe Tyler Batty's a little bit older. He signed in the 2017 class, but then he served a mission and then had a gray shirt, and then he's had 5 straight years with the COVID, and it's just kind of crazy how that kind of stretches out over time. But outside of him, not many. It's pretty standard. And BYU's had they really get how they construct their roster now. It's not only LDS players anymore under Kalani.
Okay. Well, yeah, I know Gus Malzahn at his press conference on Monday talked about BYU's defense, particularly some of the edge rushers he was very impressed with. So just looking at defense, just how would you assess how that group is done, and who are some of the names to watch on that side of the ball?
Much improved defense. Last year, they were one of the worst in the Big 12. There were signs of improvement in year one under defensive coordinator Jay Hill. Everyone knew around the program that better days were ahead, but still the stats looked much like it did at the tail end of Independence, where you're near the bottom in so many metrics. You can't stop the run. You're not generating a pass rush. It's been night and day different this year. I mean, last week they only got 1 sack, but Oklahoma State's only given up 4 sacks this season. And BYU on the season's got 12 sacks total, 12 interceptions. The top guys to keep an eye on, defensive end Tyler Batty, who I noted, number 92. He was the second team All Big 12 performer last year. Came into the season a preseason All Big 12 guy. He's only got 1 sack so far, but he commands so much attention. He's had a lot of quarterback hurries as well. He will get into the opposing opponent's backfield. I mean, he's just had a lot of success this season. I'd also keep an eye on number 17, Jack Kelly at linebacker. He's generated some buzz as of late. The Mel Kipers of the world have said he could be maybe a top 5 outside linebacker in the 2025 NFL draft class. Isaiah Glasker, another outside linebacker, 6'5", kind of a freaky athlete body type wise. He was a national player of the week a couple weeks ago for BYU. Had a monster stat line, whereas 5 tackles, I think it was 2 pass deflections, 2 tackles for loss, a sack, a pick 6. It was an insane game. But the best guy, I think, of the entire defense is the nickel, Jacob Robinson. He is an absolute star for BYU. He's a little bit undersized, but man, opponents seem to continue to throw to him, but he makes them pay. He is a big play defensive back for the Cougars. He's had a couple interceptions this season. He's someone that can dial up some blitzes with. They can do a lot of different things with Jacob Robinson. So those would be some of the key guys to watch on the defensive side.
Yeah, last thing, how do you think BYU is kind of looking at this UCF game? I don't know if trap games, what you want to, maybe it is based on UCF's record and BYU's record at this point, and with the Holy War coming up in a couple weeks after the bye week with that. And I know the quarterback said, I guess it was a compliment of UCF that he said UCF was the best 3-4 team in the nation, but UCF does have a lot of talent, just quarterback wise, haven't able to been put it all together yet. But if they can get that going, I do think UCF's a much better team than their record would show. So what's kind of the BYU outlook on UCF, and for BYU to go 8-0 and keep the streak rolling, what do you think needs to happen?
Well, UCF's ability to run the football has got BYU's complete attention, and for good reason, because last week against Oklahoma State, I talked glowingly about the defense just moments ago. Last week was not pretty. I mean, they did not stop Ollie Gordon. And really all the runners, even including Alan Bowman, was getting 4 yards pop running the football, even with him. So they stuck to that quarterback run game, Oklahoma State, despite the quarterback change, and BYU just couldn't stop it. And so that was the one week where BYU's defense underperformed this season. And so that has got BYU's complete attention, because they understand UCF is an elite running or rushing team. I mean, Jakari Brown and RJ Harvey. I mean, this is going to be quite the test. I think it's going to be tougher because of Brown at quarterback paired up with Harvey, who, if he's not Ollie Gordon, he's next in line, like right there in this league, in a league that considers itself RBU. So that's going to be the tall challenge. And I think BYU has to be dialed in. I think BYU's offense, can they avoid the big mistake? That'll be interesting to see. But yeah, I think BYU respects UCF. And I think too that there's just a respect for programs like BYU that didn't always just get everything handed to them, yet kind of, cut into the national conversation on a path less traveled. I think that's what I love about matchups like this and programs like these two, because, all the odds are always stacked against these programs for so many years. You look at just over the decades, yet they've always found ways, despite the systems that would say, well, it's over. I mean, these guys are never going to have a chance anymore, yet they find a way. And BYU's trying to do it again in this setup with the Big 12, and UCF's going to try to find its footing now going forward this season. And this could be a real turnaround game, for the Knights. And I honestly came away from that Iowa State game because I thought going into that one, Iowa State probably rolls, and maybe BYU could get it kind of a wounded dog sort of situation here where BYU just kind of puts them out of their misery and ends the season on UCF, and people are ready to, put out hot boards and call for Gus's job. But I think now there's a little bit more momentum despite the loss. So BYU better be ready. And I think they will, but they gotta do a lot better job stopping the run this week because they underperformed a week ago.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate it, Mitch. Thanks for your time and learning a lot about BYU. I'm excited for this matchup. And I guess this is one of those, you got to look at the scheduling matrix to kind of remember who's playing who each year. But yeah, UCF actually does go to BYU next season in 2025. But thank you very much, Mitch. And I'll see you in the press box on Saturday.
Looking forward to it, Brandon. And I'll talk again down the road.